People love efficiency because it promises order, savings, and predictability across entire economies. The promise of saving money by eliminating waste feels almost heroic when delivered by managers and engineers who turn inventories into cash and complexity into a scoreboard. But there is a darker story that rarely makes the glossy case studies, and that story starts with a simple question about redundancy. When you cut away all slack and buffers to make a system faster, you also remove its ability to absorb surprises without breaking. Just in time, or JIT, is a management philosophy that turns inventory into a problem to be solved. At its heart, JIT argues that every unit of stock waiting in a warehouse is capital tied up and a signal of inefficiency that can be eliminated with better coordination. The theory sounded irresistible. When parts arrive exactly when needed, factories run smoothly and companies need less space, less money, and less bureaucracy to manage stockpiles. This elegant promise of reducing waste shaped decades of manufacturing and logistics thinking around the world. The birthplace of modern JIT was Toyota in post-war Japan, where an industrial revolt against the inefficiency of stockpiles took root. Engineers like Taiichi Ohno and their teams designed Kanban cards, visual signals that turned replenishment into a choreography between stations and suppliers. Then, years after adopting these methods, Toyota saw dramatic reductions in lead time, cost, and space required for production. The factory floors became almost surgical in their precision, with parts arriving like beats in a metronome instead of random deliveries. What started as a Japanese manufacturing innovation quickly crossed oceans and sectors, finding fans in every company that wanted leaner balance sheets by the 1980s and 1990s. JIT became a global gospel, preached in boardrooms from Detroit to Shenzhen, as supply chains became more interconnected. Consultants packaged JIT into repeatable systems and certifications that promised universal gains. And multinational companies adopted the model to chase lower costs across complex supplier networks. International logistics improvements and financial incentives aligned perfectly with the lean narrative, accelerating the spread of JIT thinking. The efficiency gains from JIT were real and measurable, transforming capital allocation and corporate performance between fiscal reports. Companies that cut inventories freed cash to invest in other priorities. And share prices often rewarded managers who reported shrinking working capital on their balance sheets. Those efficiency improvements translated into cheaper products, faster innovation cycles, and an apparent competitive advantage that few firms wanted to forgo. But every efficiency victory had an unseen cost sitting quietly in the supply chain, waiting for the moment when the clock would stop. One of the philosophical pillars of JIT is the idea that inventory equals waste, and corporate accounting reinforced that belief across decades. Inventory carrying costs, storage fees, and the risk of obsolescence were easy to point to as justifications for aggressive reductions in stock. Yet removing these buffers meant that the slack which once absorbed shocks and demand surges disappeared into spreadsheets and process flows. The bookkeeping looked efficient while the network became more brittle in ways that money could not immediately reveal. To make JIT work at scale, companies invested heavily in supplier relationships and single-source strategies intended to ensure reliability. Long-term contracts and just-in-time deliveries made suppliers integral parts of the manufacturer rather than replaceable vendors on a list. This intimacy created deep efficiencies through specialization, but it also concentrated risk into fewer nodes whose failure could cascade through the entire network. When these critical suppliers encountered disruption, the lack of alternates often left factories and retailers stranded without parts or products. Globalization provided the physical infrastructure that allowed JIT to scale, as freight networks and low-cost labor created incentives to source from anywhere. Containerization, cheaper shipping, and transnational logistics hubs compressed distance and made parts flow across continents quickly and inexpensively. But as production dispersed geographically to chase lower costs, the system's complexity ballooned and visibility into upstream risks diminished significantly. Companies ended up trusting long-distance links that could be disrupted by weather, politics, or sudden demand spikes without immediate local solutions. Digital technologies promised to remove uncertainty by providing perfect information and near real-time coordination across global supply chains. Enterprise resource planning systems, barcodes, and later internet-based tracking created dashboards that made managers feel in control of unpredictability. Those systems improved responsiveness, but they also propagated a false sense of security by making optimization visible while hiding structural vulnerabilities. Data can reveal flows, but it cannot create slack where none exists. And metrics sometimes reward the wrong kinds of robustness. Economists and operations researchers long warned about the bullwhip effect, a phenomenon where small consumer demand changes amplify upstream into massive swings. In a JIT world, those oscillations are particularly dangerous because there are no buffer stocks to absorb variability, and signals travel imperfectly. These dynamic instabilities mean that a minor bump in demand at the retail end can turn into catastrophic shortages at the manufacturing end when stretches of the chain overreact. The result is a fragile dance where precise timing becomes a liability the moment rhythm is lost. Retail giants and supermarkets embraced JIT principles to optimize shelf space and reduce waste, transforming how consumers experienced product availability. Stores promised lower prices and fresher products at the expense of holding fewer days of inventory on hand. That strategy required extraordinary coordination across thousands of SKUs and tens of thousands of suppliers, and it left shelves vulnerable when shipments were delayed or demand patterns shifted abruptly. A finely tuned retail operation looks great in normal times, but reveals sharp weaknesses under stress. Before the pandemic, some analysts and supply chain veterans cautioned that global lean systems were fragile and risk-prone in ways that standard metrics did not capture. They argued that efficiency measures failed to price in tail risks and systemic shocks that occurred rarely but with massive impact. These warnings were often dismissed as conservative or too costly to implement because in stable periods, the lean approach produced undeniable profits and competitive advantage. The theoretical critiques remained academic until a global event turned them into immediate, practical problems. Then the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and the metaphors turned into reality as global flows halted and factories went silent for reasons beyond simple forecasting errors. Entire supplier ecosystems in Asia, Europe, and North America shuttered or reduced capacity at once, collapsing the invisible scaffolding that JIT had relied upon for decades. For managers who had optimized inventories down to days or hours, the sudden stoppage revealed a painful truth. Efficiency had been bought at the cost of resilience that could have bridged weeks of disruption. The world learned the difference between systems that are efficient in equilibrium and those that survive disequilibrium. One of the most visceral early images of pandemic fragility was not a factory at all, but a roll of toilet paper in a scared consumer's shopping cart. The toilet paper shortage became a cultural shorthand for broader supply chain failure because it was both immediate and absurd in its symbolism. Shelves went bare as spikes in household demand met distribution systems designed for predictable, steady flows rather than panic-driven surges. The shortage revealed how last-mile logistics and palletization conventions can make seemingly simple products hard to reallocate quickly when demand patterns break from their historical norms. Beyond toilet paper, hospitals faced severe shortages of personal protective equipment, ventilators, and essential drugs that exposed the real human cost of fragile supply chains. Medical supplies had been outsourced, consolidated, and produced just in time and places that suddenly could not export or ramp up production overnight. Health systems scrambled to procure equipment from alternative suppliers, while governments invoked national security logic to rebuild domestic capacity and strategic stockpiles. Those emergency measures underscored how critical goods cannot always be treated as ordinary commodities in times of crisis. In the same year, the Suez Canal blockage illustrated how a single choke point can paralyze flows and force immediate global ripples across industries relying on tight scheduling. A container ship lodged sideways produced backups worth billions in delayed goods, showing how concentrated infrastructure can be a fragile hinge. That event made visible the hidden dependencies and single-threaded links in global logistics that JIT exacerbated by preferring minimal redundancy. Overnight, firms and analysts began counting the true cost of delays that their previous models had treated as negligible. The economic consequences of these disruptions were immediate and varied, with factories idling, lead times stretching, and inflation emerging in unexpected sectors. Industries that had depended on components flowing in tight sequences found production schedules collapsing in domino-like fashion. The visible fallout in prices and delivery times forced boards and governments to reevaluate the hidden trade-offs that had been accepted as inevitable costs of doing business. Efficiency metrics were suddenly weighed against estimates of social and economic vulnerability that had been previously externalized. Reacting to these shocks, many governments and corporations began promoting reshoring and diversification strategies to reduce reliance on distant, concentrated suppliers. Political rhetoric matched corporate strategy as countries debated strategic autonomy in critical sectors such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and medical supplies. Companies started to face difficult economic calculations about whether higher labor costs and local production complexity were worth the insurance of resilience and supply continuity. The reshoring trend signaled a profound rethinking of how much risk the lean model should be allowed to hide behind balance sheets. At the heart of the debate is an old economic trade-off between efficiency and resilience that now plays out in real operational choices. Efficiency reduces costs in normal times, but resilience buys the ability to withstand shocks that occur infrequently yet can be devastating when they happen. Leaders must now decide how much redundancy is acceptable and how to price the intangible value of being able to continue operating during crises. Those choices will shape the global economy for decades and determine which industries remain competitive under stress. Practical resilience strategies include dual sourcing, regional stockpiles, longer lead time inventories, and smarter buffer placement that targets critical nodes instead of blanket surplus. Each approach carries cost implications and operational complexity that organizations must manage with rigor and clarity about risks. Technology also has a role to play, not just in making supply chains leaner, but in improving visibility, simulating shocks, and optimizing where redundancy provides the greatest marginal benefit. The most robust solutions combine smarter data with strategic redundancy rather than reverting to wasteful hoarding. The future will likely see a hybrid approach where efficiency and resilience coexist in more sophisticated balance than before. Firms that learn to quantify tail risks redesign contracts for flexibility, and invest in modular production capacity will likely thrive in an era of intermittent shocks. Public policy will also shape outcomes as governments decide where to subsidize resilience for national security and where to allow market-driven efficiency to prevail. The architecture of trade regulation and corporate governance will determine whether fragility becomes a recurring lesson or a resolved design flaw. We must also confront a philosophical question about whether societies should prioritize lower prices or the ability to sustain basic needs during shocks. The pandemic revealed that some efficiencies are social decisions as much as corporate strategy, and that resilience has a public good dimension that markets alone may underprovide. This is a subtle and uncomfortable conversation because it forces us to value stability in the face of uncertainty and to pay for options we hope we will not need. Ultimately, it asks whether the cost of preparedness is an insurance premium we are willing to bear for collective security. If this narrative has a moral, it is that systems optimized exclusively for efficiency can become fragile and fail spectacularly when pushed out of normal conditions. The lessons of JIT are not a condemnation of prudence, but a cautionary tale about single-minded optimization without contingency. In the years to come, supply chains will be judged not only by quarterly returns, but also by their ability to deliver in bad times and good. The challenge is to design networks that are both lean and prepared, which is harder than it looks but more necessary than ever. The pandemic gave us a rare opportunity to reassess long-standing assumptions about how we trade, store, and value essential goods across societies. For managers, policymakers, and citizens alike, the choice is now explicit: continue squeezing out every last inefficiency, or invest in redundancy that protects against the improbable but consequential shock. That decision will be political, economic, and moral, and it will require new metrics that measure social value as well as corporate returns. If we fail to adapt, the next shock will find the very same gaps. If we succeed, we create systems that are less fragile but still innovative and productive. So what should an informed citizen or executive take away from this story of prevention and vulnerability? First, resilience is not free and it is rarely glamorous, but it is a strategic choice that must be priced into decision, making like any other investment. Second, technology and policy can reduce the cost of resilience if they are used to create smarter redundancy rather than simply more inventory. And finally, the fragility revealed by JIT is fixable, but it requires collective action and a willingness to rethink what efficiency actually means for societies. The story of just-in-time is a parable about trade-offs that apply beyond supply chains, touching finance, healthcare, and civic infrastructure in equal measure. In each domain, we must balance immediate performance with the capacity to survive stress, and those balances will shape resilience for generations. If you find the idea that efficiency bought fragility both unsettling and enlightening, you are not alone, and that reaction is the start of better policy and wiser corporate practice. Understanding these dynamics gives us the power to design systems that keep delivering, even when everything else falters. If this video gave you a new way to look at the systems that bring goods to your life, then the conversation is already starting to change. The question now is whether companies and governments will act to rebalance efficiency with resilience before the next shock arrives. If you want more explorations of the hidden systems that shape our world and the choices that define them, subscribe and join the discussion. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and stay curious.